Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. Today we are joining Professor Rajeev Srinivasan, an adjunct professor for innovation at IIM Bangalore. We're going to talk about Abhijit Banerjee and his economics prize, and the way he used the algorithms he used to come up with his thesis. Rajeev, welcome to PGurus channel.
Thank you very much, Sri. Good to be here.
So Rajeev, Abhijit Banerjee, he is it's not, this is an award that was not instituted by the Nobel Committee, was it? Isn't it? The economics Nobel Prize.
That's right. Technically, it is the Sverige Riksbank Prize. That is the Swedish Central Bank's prize.
Right.
And it's not a real Nobel, but for all practical purposes, I guess people call it a Nobel.
Right.
So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. However, I guess it's also, just like the Peace Prize, a little bit political. So sometimes one wonders about the people who win them. A brilliant example of this is the people who won it a few years ago, Myron Scholes and Fraser Black. These guys were options trading guys. In fact, there is this famous Black-Scholes equation that bears their name. Unfortunately, a little later, they started a company called Long-Term Capital Management, and it was supposed to be, with the brilliance of the Nobel Prize winning economists.
Right. How could they lose, right?
How could they lose? And in fact, they did. It melted down and they just got wiped out. So there is some mirth when people talk about the Nobel Prize in economics. And also, my personal peeve is that the previous Indian winner of this was our good old friend, I shouldn't say friend, but the great Amartya Sen.
Right.
And Amartya Sen has said a number of things, none of which in hindsight seems to be very true. For example, he has this Kerala model, which is supposed to explain why Kerala has got a high sustainable development goal index or human development index. But, as a native Keralite, I think most of it can be explained with one simple word: money order economy. It's a whole bunch of people who have gone outside, especially the Middle East, and they're working very hard there and sending money back. And that's the reason why Kerala is relatively prosperous. There's nothing more mysterious than that. So, the history of the Nobel Peace Prize and this economics prize are both slightly dicey as compared to the physics, chemistry, and medicine, the science prizes. So that's the sort of background for this prize. And then moving forward to the three who won it this year, it's Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo of MIT. Esther happens to be his old grad student and also his wife. And then a gentleman named Kramer, and I can never remember his first name. I think it's Harry Kramer at Harvard. So these three had collaborated on poverty economics. And in fact, I think they've written books on it. I don't remember the name, but something like Poverty Economics, I think, was the name of a famous book of theirs. And I was looking at them. I'm not an expert by any means in development economics, although I took some courses at Stanford at one point. In time, I toyed with the idea of joining the World Bank in their young professionals program, but I didn't do that. So I have a little interest in this area. So in my days, which was in the late 80s, Abhijit Banerjee was not well known. He was not at all in the literature. So I presume he must have started writing broadly after that. And my concern as sort of an outsider looking in is the basis of his Nobel Prize, which is RCT, otherwise known as Randomized Controlled Tests, where you take a small sample population and you have a control population to which you do nothing, and then you do some interventions to the other population, and these two are supposed to, between them, form a statistically relevant sample. And once you get some results out of this, then you broadly suggest that it's applicable across the spectrum of all people and in all countries and so forth. So that's the basis of RCT. To me, this is a little nervous-making because the people who have used RCT the most in the past and continue to do so are the drug industry guys, the pharma people. And I've seen a lot of concern about pharma results where people say, look, you ran these experiments on a small section of the population. To begin with, you ran it only on white college students because they were the most easily accessible people. And then you ran it on white people in America, and then you maybe ran it on some black people in America. And then based on that, how can you say this medicine will work for everybody anywhere in the world? But that is, in fact, exactly what the drug companies say, or at least in the past, that's what they've said. Now they're beginning to use more guinea pigs in India, etc. But even that, I'm a little bit suspicious about, because I have some idea of the way these FDA drug trials work and how people do all kinds of manipulations on them. So fundamentally, there are procedural issues with the RCTs being used in drug trials. And that at least is physiology, because it's your body functioning in certain ways when a certain drug is imposed on you. But in the behavioral sciences, I think it's even less likely that your RCT is going to be accurate. And I have the support of Nassim Nicholas Taleb in saying this. If you remember, Taleb was the guy who wrote Black Swan,
Right.
and he's a famous statistician and sort of a philosopher, and I guess a public intellectual. And he said in a very cutting tweet that he had been very dubious about the Nobel Prize in economics, and it's finally reached its nadir in 2019. So I'm thinking he is talking about the statistical part and some of the concerns that I mentioned, kind of thing, in terms of how valid are these broad generalizations that he can make. And in fact, there's one more thing that I get very nervous about, because we have a tendency to assume that all distributions are Gaussian, the bell curve.
Right.
But what
Right.
if they're not? Then your assumptions just go out the window. So that's one major concern I have about what's going on here. Do you know that your experiments, and let me just digress for a minute into the experiments that they did. What Duflo and Banerjee and company did is they've done some interventions in poor countries. For example, they would do something that looked at, for example, the midday meal scheme, and the early intervention in terms of textbooks being allocated and better healthcare and things like that for one group, and then the other control group didn't get those interventions. And then they would say, okay, let's see the results. At the end of the day, the people who got the treatment or intervention of whatever kind have shown better academic results. And therefore, correlation suggests causation, which is also a slightly dubious thing, meaning that these two things happen together, therefore there is a causal relationship. And then they say, look, therefore, whatever intervention we did in this country is appropriate for all countries for all time. Now, I go back to a very famous Stanford biologist and primatologist named Robert Sapolsky. He won the Genius Award from the MacArthur Foundation, which is, the equivalent, I would say, of getting a Nobel Prize in terms of prestige, and also it's more money. It's like $500,000 that you get. So Sapolsky has spent a lot of his time studying baboons in Africa, and he's formed some really interesting theories. And I was reading a little bit of his work called Behave. This very, very interesting point that he makes. He says human behavior is based on a very large number of things. The obvious things, your nurture and your nature. That is how you were brought up and what your genetic structure, what your parents gave you. So those things are obvious. But he says, in addition, there are many, many other things. For example, the fact that you had a fight with your spouse last week, what you ate for dinner last night, the fact that you had a car accident, 2 months ago. And not only that, something that happened to your ancient ancestors. Maybe one of your ancestors was attacked by a saber-toothed tiger in, 10,000 years past or something, and how did they react? So he says there are very many variables. So that brings up this question, okay, you're doing a randomized controlled trial. How many of these variables can you control for? And furthermore, do you even know what those variables are? In the drug trials, as I said, the variables are race, education, nutrition level, maybe height, weight, things like that. So you presume those are controllable. But if your saber-tooth ancestor is one of the control variables, I don't know exactly how you're going to control for that. So I think there's a really big issue in the background here, which is how valid is the RCT. So that is my major concern about randomly taking these results and applying them to all circumstances in all countries and all times.
Rajiv, just to make sure that I understand correctly, the Federal Drugs Administration, FDA, the FDA approves RCT testing as a test case, doesn't it?
Yes,
Okay.
the FDA has a very elaborate set of tests. And the last stage of that, and it takes like 10 years to do it. The
Yes.
last stage is these tests on human beings. And this is basically an RCT. And that's what I was talking about.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm well familiar with this. I've worked in the healthcare industry and working towards FDA approvals. You need to have meticulous notes of every failure and every success. And everything has to be submitted in a certain format. And usually you start here and then you work your way up. That's how thick the binder becomes. By the time you submit it to FDA, it's like the root canal procedure, as painful as that. Because their findings, they'll give you, once they start finding things, they give you very little time to counter it. So you need to really make sure that you've got your marbles right before you submit it, so that you have a higher chance of success. But interesting thing, money is no object there, because you really need to know the exact word or wording that the FDA person is looking for, and you make sure that those things find prominent place in your submissions. But be that as it may, now where has Abhijit Banerjee's work been applied in any specific industry in India?
He has done a bunch of, I mean, it's generally related to poverty, right? So it's not industry oriented.
Right.
So the interventions that he does have, some of the trials have been in India. And I don't know the exact details of that, because India is obviously a very good catchment area for anybody doing poverty studies.
Yeah.
And the problem I have, again, one more issue is, who has done the largest poverty alleviation in history? Well, that's the Chinese. And the Chinese didn't listen to Abhijit Banerjee. They have had no eminent economists, right? So how did they do it? Well, they probably didn't follow any of the nostrums that Abhijit has been talking about. And secondly, I was looking at some data from Poverty Clock, which is an entity that studies poverty around the world. And the results are startling. India has been doing exceedingly well in poverty reduction. And the curve, I don't have that curve handy with me right now, but, it shows a fall that is extremely steep. And according to them, they project that by the year 2023, only 3% of India's population will be really poor. And India had the dubious distinction of having the largest absolute number of people in poverty. But that unfortunate distinction now belongs to Nigeria. And there's at least one other country that has overtaken us in the number of absolute poor. And you must remember that their populations are significantly smaller than India's. So at least two countries have more poor people than India. And how did India achieve this? Well, certainly not by following Abhijit Banerjee's advice. They probably kept him out of it quite a bit, except, his latest claim to fame. In fact, to be honest, I'd not heard of him until recently, when he was the guy who gave the intellectual sustenance to the Congress Nyay program, NYAY.
Yes.
And in that context, he also said something which made me really unhappy. He talked about inflation tax. He said India doesn't have inflation, or at least doesn't have enough inflation. And that really killed me. I'm thinking, what has inflation done to us all these years? I know for a fact that the rupee's purchasing power has plummeted, because what my parents paid like 1 rupee for, I have to pay 100 rupees for. This is absolutely evident in real estate. They bought some land, and that land, I have to pay 100 times more in rupees. what that has meant is that the value of the rupee has been severely affected and depreciated over time. And by doing that, what you're doing, and this is inflation tax, and by doing that, what you're doing is you are severely affecting savers and you are benefiting borrowers.
Yes.
And that means, people like Mehul Choksi and Vijay Mallya and so forth, who borrowed lots of money, are the beneficiaries. So in a way, it's intellectually deceptive to say inflation tax or more inflation is a good thing. So this is my other concern, separately from the RCT, about following his nostrils.
Well, Rajiv, real estate in India has gone out of whack a long time ago, and that needs to come back to normal levels from stratospheric levels. And that's not something that is going to go away. Although I suspect that now the real estate across the many metropolitan cities has kind of leveled off, and it is actually going down just a little bit. The higher priced homes are not finding buyers. And also buyers are now being told in no uncertain terms that the whole money has to be come up. You have to come up with the money in white. And that causes a bit of a problem, because that means that it's money that you'd have, you'd have paid tax on. And so there are some systemic problems. However, I'm told that the white component in real estate purchases now has risen to more than 80% or 90%. Although, these things are hard to track because the market value, that number that the market value is supposed to be, is very deceptive in India. And I don't know if somebody has meticulously gone through that and say, this is the market value of this property in this city, and therefore anything below this or above this is, not acceptable. What are your perceptions after demonetization? Has there been an effect on the real estate?
Very significant effect, because now, as you said, people have to show proof of where they got their money, which means that black money is kind of gone out of circulation quite a bit. And as far as valuations are concerned, there was a very interesting case in the southern city of Cochin recently. The government ordered that a block of apartments be demolished because they had violated coastal zoning regulations. And when that happened, these were flats that were sold for, if I remember correctly, 1.25 crores or something, somewhere in that range. But the assessed value that the government said those flats were worth was 25 lakhs.
Wow,
right? So
5 times.
there is this huge delta. Secondly, when this thing about demolition happened, a lot of people who had bought them just kept very quiet, totally. Some of them, in effect, abandoned their claim to the apartments because they probably, I'm assuming, couldn't show proper source for their investment in those flats. And there was this one left-wing journalist, a TV star, a TV anchor, who apparently got this flat for like 10 lakh rupees, whereas its nominal worth was, as I said, 1.5 crores or something. So still stuff is happening, and the official government valuation is a joke. And that is the white money component. If it's valued by the government at 25 lakhs, you have to show 25 lakhs in your registration documents. And neither the buyer nor the seller has an incentive to show anything higher, because the higher the value, the more you have to pay in, in registration taxes. Right. So everybody has an incentive to show that as low as possible. And then whatever else is paid is black money. So that's the way it has been working. And now that with demonetization, that's become less easy. Prices have either stalled or they have gone down quite a bit, especially in places like Bombay.
So you own property in Kerala, right? Thiruvananthapuram, probably, or?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. And do you have annual property tax there?
Yeah.
Okay. So there is a registration tax, which is a one-time, perhaps a certain percentage of the sale value. And then you have, okay, go ahead.
Something like 8% or something. I don't remember, some number.
8% of
something like that.
Even at, if it is 1 crore, that's 8 lakhs.
Yeah, it's I don't see. I haven't bought any property for a long time. What I have is what my dad gave me, so I don't know. But it's a noticeable amount of money that you have to pay
Wow, wow.
for
So
registration.
if that is the case, then real estate purchases should have completely come to a grinding halt now.
Well, in a way, yeah, it's stopped. It's slowed down definitely.
I see, I see. But then this is the thing that is interesting. At least apartments, high-rise apartments in places like Mumbai and other big metropolis, they have not moved for close to 42 months or something like that, and the price has still stayed the same. You would expect that if the property isn't moving and it is seen through three monsoons, which means that all the leaks are beginning to show up, the cracks will be there. It's called as cement breathing. Come up with some new bird buzzwords, and still the owner wants to hang on to it. So what gives, Rajiv?
Uh, I have heard of similar stories where, for example, the builder isn't actually finishing the property.
I see.
Okay, so the owners are in trouble because the builder has not completed their obligations, and therefore the owner has no alternative. They just have to wait until either the builder finishes it and then they're able to occupy it, or maybe the electricity hasn't come, or all sorts of things like that. There are any number of cases. And by the way, there was a recent announcement about the central government releasing 25,000 crores to the real estate industry to
Right.
try and get some of these stalled projects going. But I agree with you. If there is an extended period of time that a building is not occupied, it's probably deteriorating rapidly, and it ends up being relatively worthless. So there is a lot of money locked up in real estate. That see, on the other hand, if it's a completed apartment building or apartment that you're not selling because you don't need to sell it right now, that could be it. You hold on to it until the valuation that you're expecting comes back. So that could be the other reason people are not.
I can tell you with near 100% certainty, Rajiv, and this is also for the viewers, the stratospheric valuations that real estate got under the UPA regime is not coming back. As a matter of fact, real estate is probably headed for a correction. If I'm not wrong, I think the 30% correction is, I mean, I can predict that. And I'm saying that just from the fact that the buyers are just not there. The sellers can hold out for as long as they want till kingdom come. But I think you will see these unsold things starting to move when the CBI and ED start attaching properties under Benami and Black Money Act, and they've started doing that. They went for the big enchilada first, and in fact, the rumor is that this big enchilada owns 1/6 of real estate in Bangalore. That is really significant. I mean, in the sense that all those. If you go through the outer ring road, you'll see all those multi tower rise buildings. These are all allegedly properties of this very distinguished individual. I will leave the name to be filled out by our viewers, and you know who I'm talking about. And if you watch our videos, you know. But be that as it may, so I think that is where I think the cookie is going to start crumbling. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have felt that real estate valuations are way unrealistic. For example, a house in Trivandrum, which is not even, a tier one city, it costs so much money. The
Right.
land itself costs a lot, and then the construction costs are non-trivial. They're approaching what I remember as California prices. When I was living there, of course, California prices have gone through the roof now. But a person's paying maybe $200,000-300,000
Hmm.
for a house in Trivandrum. And I'm like, this doesn't really make sense.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that's $200,000 is 1.4 crores or something like that, and that's what you end up having to pay even for some luxury flats in Trivandrum. So yeah, the real estate business has been thoroughly infiltrated by black money and inflated valuations, and so that has to change. And that's as much as lots of people decry demonetization, that may be a lasting legacy of that effort, which obviously made a lot of people unhappy. And just a couple of days ago, we had the anniversary of demonetization. So there was a huge fuss about how people died standing in line in ATM counter lines and so forth. But yeah, so this may well be one of the things that made things more rational.
Well, we have to wait and see how this plays out. Thank you very much, Rajeev. We will be back with more such interesting conversations. Certainly, Rajeev and I are both engineers, and we happen to have economics as our hobby. And I can sense the viewers who happen to be professional economists roll their eyes that, here we go again. Two engineers talking about economics. But I think we talk about common sense economics, and we also talk about macroeconomics, not microeconomics. And sometimes microeconomics does come in. But thank you very much, Rajeev. And viewers, please subscribe to our channel. And if you can, please donate to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sri.
Thank you.